Now this quilt is nearly done. We've just got one side left. I want to add some movement and a little bit of whimsy to this quilt, and we're going to do that by adding some free-form feathers in the space that remains. Let's go meet at the marking table, and I'll show you just how easy it is to get a feather going.
No matter what kind of feather you're going to stitch, every feather always begins by determining the curve of the feather spine, and this is partly determined by the space you are trying to fill. So, lay your quilt out and examine it, and once you've determined the space that will be occupied by the feather, begin bending your flexible curve ruler into a pleasing curve that will ultimately be the curve of the feather's spine. You'll need space on each side of the spine to stitch nice plumes, so be sure to bend it in a way that will leave you that space. Once you've got a curve that you like, trace alongside the ruler with a temporary marker, and now you are ready to return to the sewing machine to stitch your feather. I begin stitching my feather at the base, and I am stitching toward the tip or the final curl of the feather. What we are stitching here is what I call the basic freeform feather. I begin stitching at the spine guideline, and I'm building this feather by adding plume after plume as I work my way up the marked spine guideline. As long as I work in a way that respects that guideline, I am assured that my final feather will have the same wonderful curve as the guideline, so I know it's all right to get a little bit off the guideline, but overall, your goal should be to try to stick with that guideline. Now, each time that I leave the guideline, I initially hug the curve of the preceding plume and swing outward or laterally or away from the spine guideline, and then I curve back inward and carry that stitching line all the way back to the guideline. That's very important, and I actually try to touch the thread of the last plume stitched on that side, so that gives you an idea of just how far back I do carry that stitching line. Now there are many types of feathers that can be stitched, but all feathers fall into two categories: feathers that have true stitch spines and freeform feathers. This freeform feather that we are now stitching does not have a true stitch spine. Instead, it has what I call an implied spine, and we are creating that illusion of a spine by repeatedly bringing our stitching line all the way back to the spine guideline and actually touching the threads of the last plume. If you don't carry that stitching line all the way back, you won't be able to create the illusion of a spine, and your feather really won't have much integrity. Notice that as I work, I can easily stretch a plume or contract a plume to fit in the space that's available to me. This attribute makes feathers and all plume-based designs extremely versatile because they can easily be forced to fit in all kinds of shapes and spaces on your quilt. One thing that can sometimes stymie you when you're first learning to stitch feathers is a belief that all the plumes need to be roughly the same size, and that is simply not true. In fact, having some variety in the sizes and shapes of your plumes will actually make your feather look more interesting. As I enter the curl of the feather, I need to be mindful that plumes are going to be stitched on both sides of this curl, so I need to make sure I leave some room for the plumes that will be stitched on the opposite side of the curl. When you're stitching a curl, you can make your feather tightly curled or loosely curled, and you have complete control of that by how much unquilted space you leave inside your curl. Now, I really like the drama of a tightly curled feather, so as I stitch, I am deliberately taking up all available space within this curl. If your goal is to have a loosely curled feather, leave some empty or unquilted space inside of that curl area.
So you've learned the basics of how to stitch a basic freeform feather, but we've still got a fair amount of space left that we need to fill on that quilt. Let's head back to the marking table and I'll show you how easy it is to set up a situation where you've got a feather flowing from another feather.
This is super easy. Once you've decided what area will be filled with your next feather, you start to bend your flexible curve ruler so that the new feather will begin at a space between two plumes and then curve into the area you're hoping to fill. Once you're happy with that curve, just trace alongside your ruler and you're ready to head back to the sewing machine. I begin stitching in a space between two plumes, and again, I'm building a basic freeform feather by adding plume after plume, all the while respecting this marked spine guideline. The key to feather flowing, and by that I'm referring to this design of flowing one feather off an already stitched feather, is to pick a spot between two plumes and to create a curve that appears like it would flow naturally from that point. As long as you flow your feathers in this way, they will always look believable because it will appear to the viewer that this is a natural phenomenon rather than a forced phenomenon. As I work, I sometimes get close to the marked line by the edge of the quilt. When you're stitching feathers in an outer border area, if you can get into the habit of marking a 1/2 inch line from the edges of your quilt's outer border, then you'll avoid stitching plumes in the area that will ultimately be covered by binding. There is nothing more frustrating than stitching a beautiful feather only to have the tips of some of the plumes be lopped off by the binding.
So now you know how to stitch a basic freeform feather and also how to stitch a feather that is flowing off another feather. These feathers are so much fun, and that's why I wanted to give you a taste of just how much fun they can be. Now I'm going to fill up the remaining space on that quilt by flowing other feathers off the feathers that are stitched. It's that easy. Know that there are all kinds of ways to play with feathers by altering plume shapes or plume proportions, or by stitching your feather spines so that they create a shape like a wreath or a feathered heart. You can also hyperquilt feathers or overquilt them with decorative threads to completely change their personalities. If you're looking for more fun techniques to transform your feathers, check our book, Feather Adventures, or one of our many DVDs about free motion feather designs.